This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 140 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's a special episode. Regular listeners will know every 10 episodes I do something a bit different. And today it's a solo episode with me, prompted by a really good suggestion from one of my thoughtful travellers in the Facebook group, Justin. And his suggestion was, how do you think your next trip to Denmark will challenge your son and yourself to be thoughtful travellers? He thought I could discuss this. It's an awesome idea. And Justin went on to say, what are our expectations, things we'd like to discover, cultural differences to explore, and all of that. And I think since I say the phrase thoughtful travel so often, I think it really is a good idea to stop for a moment, be a bit extra thoughtful about it, and kind of articulate what I really think it means, and think about it in the context of this actual trip that we're leaving for shortly. By the time this episode comes out, we will be mid-Denmark, but at the moment we are we're 3 or 4 days away from leaving, but we've got a week in Thailand first, so about 10 days from arriving in Denmark. It's a country I visited once as a 9-year-old. I don't remember a whole lot about the cultural aspects. I remember a lot about the sightseeing. I remember seeing the Little Mermaid. I remember desperately wanting to buy a Danish scarf, a red and white scarf, and I didn't, which was probably wise because in my childhood in Australia, I wouldn't have worn a scarf very often. So it wasn't wise on my part. My parents decided that was less wise because parents are smart sometimes. And so for me, I feel like it's certainly my first trip as an adult, and it's really the first time to discover Denmark properly. And I'm always interested in looking at European countries because the culture is not so different to Australia. Like when I first moved to Germany, I was a bit disappointed because the culture seemed on the surface fairly similar. But it's one of those places when you dig a little deeper, then you learn a lot more. And that's really fascinating. As much as I love traveling, for example, somewhere in Asia where the culture is really obviously different, sometimes it's even more intriguing to travel in a culture which is less obviously different, and you have to be, well, I suppose, a bit more thoughtful about it. So before I get onto that, I thought I maybe should say what I think thoughtful travel is. And later in the episode, I've got some other not trips. I'm thinking of trips, aren't I? Some other tips about being a thoughtful traveller, which I've sourced from members of the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. But I will direct you to a blog post I wrote early last year. I'll leave a link in the show notes, but it's basically all about what is thoughtful travel and what I think thoughtful travel is. And I wrote there, and it still stands, being a thoughtful traveller means that you stop and think, the emphasis is all about thinking really, before, during and after a trip. So sometimes this whole kind of thoughtful travel thing draws on mindfulness and being present, from planning travel that suits your values and fits in with what you want to, see more of in the world. And sometimes it might look something like slow travel or eco travel or even volunteerism, and sometimes not. Sometimes none of those. Sometimes it's just that you are thinking more and being more present in your experiences. So that's kind of, I suppose, where I think thoughtful travel lies. And Justin's suggestion for this episode about being a thoughtful traveller in Denmark really got me thinking about what I've already done to be thoughtful about this trip. And I suppose I want to go back to actually that moment of when I decided to take this trip. And you may have heard me say it was all a bit random. We actually have a family wedding to attend in Thailand, and I was keeping an eye on great airfare deals because I wanted to, go to Thailand and maybe somewhere else at the same time. I was just looking out for a, interesting deal. I was thinking somewhere else in Asia, but then this great airfare came up where we could stop in Thailand, go to the wedding and continue on to Copenhagen. And of course, my son heard this and said, oh my goodness, yes, we have to go because we can go to Danish Legoland because he has, a Legoland obsession. If you follow my blog, you'll have noticed. And, that was obviously something that, was a swaying factor. But actually, I've for some years been highly curious about the Danish culture, and mostly that's through seeing TV and reading things like, Danes are the happiest people in the world, or, such a high standard of living and, great livability and all of these kinds of interesting studies that come out from time to time. I actually think a lot of it stems back to seeing The Killing, which is one of those TV drama series that is Danish, filmed in Denmark and in Danish. You might remember the lead detective. Was she a detective? I think so. Anyway, Sarah Lund had these very Scandinavian-looking knitted jumpers. They are not very stylish, but they're very much present in that show. And just before this option came up to book these airfares, I had binge-watched on Netflix the Danish TV show Rita. If you haven't watched Rita, I highly recommend it as a study in cultural differences and simply because it's a great show. There are 4 seasons and I watched them all with great delight. Rita is about a school teacher. Rita is the school teacher. She's a little bit different, I suppose. She probably doesn't fit the mould of a school teacher in probably in any country. And also not in Denmark. But I was utterly fascinated by the school system in Denmark, which was clearly depicted in this series. You start with a group of around 20 kids, and you will stay with that group, just that group, all the way through, I think, 9 or 10 years of schooling with the same teacher. And I think from what I can read and hear, that's fairly standard. And to me, that's incredible. In fact, while I was binge watching this show, I was often talking to my son's teacher about this very topic. And she would say, well, some of these kids I'd love to teach for years, but I don't know about all of them. And I could see her point. But I think that the Danish school system it makes your school class into a bit of a family. And, with your family, you can't choose who they are and you learn a way to get along with all of them. And it was very interesting. They call their teacher by their first name. There's no uniform. We have always uniforms here in Australia. There was all sorts of, little things that I found really intriguing. So that, I guess, before this airfare came up was already the beginning of my, highly curious questioning about Danish culture. And so, of course, after we booked the trip, then I try and saturate myself in anything I can that tells me more about the country. I love to do that. Not so much, I'll read guidebooks and stuff, but not so much about the sightseeing, more about, reading novels set in the place, watching TV series set there, just to kind of get that, what else is going on in this country kind of thing. So there was a couple more Netflix series I watched. Dicte, D-I-C-T-E, my Danish pronunciation is terrible. It was a great sort of a crime series, drama series, I suppose. Dicte is a journalist sorry for butchering the Danish pronunciation, but in Aarhus, top centre of Denmark. It's hard to describe. It's not a standard shape with all those islands. That was another interesting one to get, more insight into the Danish culture and to learn more and more about how it's different to Australia. And then for Christmas, I bought myself the book, The Year of Living Danishly by Helen Russell. And she is a British journalist who moved to Denmark initially for 12 months because her husband had got a job working for Lego, which is like such a cool reason to move to Denmark. But of course, they were living, in a rural area because Lego is made in Billund, which is definitely quite far from the big smoke. And I was fascinated by this book. So Helen describes the experiences of living in Denmark as an expat. And there was a lot of parallels with my experiences living in Germany as an expat. For example, she tells the story of some of her neighbours whose names she didn't know, and they sort of this kind of awkward standoff where they never introduced themselves, and she referred to them as being Mr. Beards 1, 2, and 3 because they all had beards and they were all men. And one of my favourite stories about the Mr. Beards is that, so Danes are very interested or obsessed perhaps with the Danish flag. I'd seen this in the Danish TV shows I'd watched. For example, on people's birthdays, at their birthday party, people all have Danish flags and they're waving them around, which to me seemed really unusual. And I was wondering, is it like a mega patriotism? But it's not. It's just kind of a tradition as far as I can understand. Certainly there's no Aussie flag waving at any of our birthday parties. But anyway, so the flag is a big thing. And in the Year of Living Danishly, Helen describes how she and her husband excitedly found in their rented home that they had a flagpole. So they erected this flagpole and they had the Danish flag there. But then their friend from Switzerland was coming to visit, and Helen thought, oh, I've got a great idea. I'm going to greet him by having a Swiss flag up our flagpole, which seems lovely. So they go to pick up their Swiss friend at the airport, and then they arrive back at their little house in rural Denmark, and the three Mr. Beards are there around the flagpole kind of muttering. And so, there's this interesting welcoming committee for their Swiss friend, and the three Mr. Beards kind of explain that, you can't really fly the flag of another country, or they begin to explain, but then they disappear for a bit. Short time later, they appear again at their home. And in the interim, one of them has printed out from, I don't know where you would print this out from because we don't have such rules, but they have printed out a set of rules about what you can and can't do with the Danish flag. They have laminated the rules and they have them ready to give to their neighbour, Helen, and her husband, so that they do not break these Danish rules about the flag anymore in the future. So they sheepishly take down their Swiss flag, put up the Danish one, and they never change it again, I imagine. When I lived in Germany, there's a lot of rules in Germany too, and, nobody really tells you about them. And I was regularly getting told off by my neighbours who, honestly, I probably could have called them Mr. Beards 1, 2 and 3. They were elderly gentlemen who had retired and probably didn't have much else to do except keep an eye on what the rogue foreigner in the second floor flat was doing. And they would tell me off sometimes by, coming to my door and explaining something, sometimes by leaving anonymous notes in my letterbox, like the time when I washed the car in the car park. And that's actually kind of against probably German law. I think it's certainly really not done at all because the groundwater, I don't know, they don't want the detergent in the groundwater, etc., and they recycle it if you go to a proper car wash, etc., etc. It's all a great reason. Just nobody told me, so I just did it the way I would have done it back in Australia until I got that anonymous note, and I never did it wrong ever again. But anyway, those kind of experiences of moving somewhere as an expat to somewhere that's quite rigid in their rules is something that I just loved reading in the Year of Living Danishly. But there was all sorts of other, it was just a great book, and whether or not you're going to Denmark, I highly recommend it. It was all about basically based on the premise that Denmark is regularly in the top few of the happiest countries in the world. And what are they doing to be so happy? So Helen looked at all sorts of different ways that people can be happy, and it was fascinating. She also mentioned quite regularly the amazing Danish bakeries, and she's not the first person who has brought that to my attention, and I am definitely going to sample a large number of Danish pastries for purely research purposes on my trip. So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is that these are some of the things I've been thinking about Denmark before I get there. And when I'm there, I want to try and figure out, how many of these are true and, where do the stereotypes end and what's different from the stereotype to the reality. How do the people live, how do different people live in different ways in Denmark? And obviously, I'm only there for a couple of weeks. I can't, I certainly can't even do the in-depth research that Helen did in the Year of Living Danishly. But what I can do is be kind of really aware of trying to get to know local people during the opportunities I can, trying to chat to them. And I've got a lot of questions already in my mind. And, I think that if you've got somewhere to start, then you've got a lot more chance of finding something out and, sort of showing a real interest in the country and, getting to know some people at a deeper level by, having something to talk about that's not just, oh, goodness, the weather. So this is how I hope it'll pan out. I've got a few things organised, like there's a little company in Copenhagen that runs really small group canal tours, and they've got this amazing ethos where they, they really want the travellers to get to know the captains on the boats, and to, really be able to have conversations that are, a bit more meaningful. So, that kind of thing I think will be interesting. I'm going to meet up with Erin, who you may have heard on a previous episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, who's American but has been living in Denmark for, I want to say, like maybe 3 years or more now. So, I've got a billion questions for her as well. And all of it will come together when I get back and I stop and think again after the trip. There's always little things you come up, you don't even, things you don't even know exist, and then you can come home and do even more research about it. So I guess that sort of answers your question, Justin, about what I'm thinking about my next trip to Denmark. I try and be kind of open with my expectations and about what I want to discover, but I do have some cultural differences that I have in mind that I want to know more about and explore. So we will see. But at the same time, I think it's useful for us to think about what we all think it means to be a thoughtful traveller. And so some of the kind of explanations that I got when I asked the Facebook group were some of these. So, for example, Celeste says to learn the basics in advance about the culture where you're travelling. So certainly so that you don't feel so if you see something happen that you think is unusual or wrong, it probably isn't. It's just a culturally different thing. I mean, the typical thing is, for example, in Japan, people don't tend to blow their nose if they have a cold or, have a runny nose. They tend to sniff because that's seen as more polite and more hygienic. If you don't know that and you see it happen, you might, as a Westerner, certainly as an Aussie, you might think, oh, that's kind of disgusting. It's certainly not to them. And so I think those kind of learning basics in advance is really important, because otherwise you could have a really inappropriate reaction, and you're a guest in their country. So that really makes it inappropriate. So I think, it's a good thing. Megan said that she thought thoughtful travel starts with keeping an open mind, asking questions rather than assuming things. So true. And listening to the answers and respecting what you hear. And I think that latter part is really important, because it starts with opening your mind and asking questions, but sometimes it can be really hard to respect what you hear. You might hear something that you think is wrong or is so different to your culture, but really there's not often a wrong, there's just a different. I think that having respect for the local way of thinking is really important, and it doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but you should respect that that's the local way, at least. And Justin went on with the thoughtful travel idea also to mention respectful clothing. He was in Penang at the time when he commented, said he was wearing long trousers to temples visiting in Penang, but not many foreigners were. And, I think it can be a bit disrespectful to be, especially if you're just in a tank top or a spaghetti top or something like that. It's not okay. So important. That's part of being thoughtful as well, to respect, basic cultural things like that. Anna said that for her, above all, it's to remember that one is a guest in another person's country and leave the sense of entitlement at home. So true. Curiosity and flexibility go a long way to allowing the serendipitous to happen. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more about curiosity and flexibility, and sort of saying yes to things. I know when I lived in Japan, the oddest things would happen to me just because I said yes to, whatever my Japanese friends suggested. Like I went fishing the Japanese way. I actually saw this on a Japanese reality show recently. Again, it reminded me. And it was the kind of fishing where, I don't know if this happens in any other country, I only know of it from Japan, but where there's kind of a section of sort of river, I suppose, and it's broken up into sections with kind of rocks and stuff. So I guess the water can flow a bit, but when you go there to go fishing, you pay an amount, or maybe you pay afterwards after you've caught them. But someone has already caught the fish, or they've been bred there or whatever, and they bring a bucket full of fish and empty them into your section of the river. You then grab your fishing rod and you go fishing. And of course, there's this very small area of water with quite a high concentration of fish, and it's pretty easy to catch some. So I went on this fishing trip with my Japanese friends, and, I didn't say anything the whole day. I didn't even say to them, oh, we would never do this and this is really weird. I just went with the flow and we had a ball. I think being curious and flexible is very important. Now, Susan had a completely different kind of a different idea to add to the thoughtful travel, which I hadn't thought of but is actually true. And she said that part of thoughtful traveling is having things in order at home. So, being thoughtful about who you leave behind, I guess, is what she's saying, and what you leave behind. So she said, for example, pre-planning for a house sitter, leaving information for the house sitter about if you've got pets, emergency contacts and stuff, having a person at home who's got your travel itinerary and contact details, in case anything happens and then they know where you are. Making sure that you have, travel insurance and all that sort of stuff. So I think that is really important, and I think I have been a good thoughtful traveller for this trip. I have a lovely house sitter coming to take care of my lovely cats. I hope they behave for her, and I think that it certainly makes me feel better to know that there's someone in my home, and I know it's nicer for my cats than going off to cat kennels somewhere. And it's also cheaper, of course. But my cats are old. I don't think they like that stuff anyway. So now Angela said she would add to the thoughtful travel idea that you should have a sense of openness and engagement, and that adds to your experience as a way to connect with local people. And through connecting with the local people, she said, we get a deeper sense of place and learn more about what lies beneath the beautiful sights. And I think that that is very true. And sometimes in the past, I've been not reluctant to connect with locals, but shy about it, or I'm, it's not always been easy for me. I think since I travel with my son, it's become a lot easier. Like having a kid along with you is just an opening for so many conversations. And I think that that's a real advantage. He's still young enough that it's interesting. It's not like he's not quite a young adult looking yet. He's 9, so, he still looks like a cute kid. So, I think that's still a really easy way for me to start to connect with local people. And it's funny, I was just saying to him the other day, and this was really part of my thoughtful travel idea as well as keeping him amused, that so he's really into soccer. And I said, when we get to Denmark, we're there for 2 weeks. We've got an Airbnb, then we've got a car. So there's not, we'll be quite flexible in what we bring or carry around for that fortnight. And I said, we should buy you a soccer ball in Denmark. And then wherever we're staying, we can go out to the local park and kick it around. And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. And of course, what I'm thinking is this is going to be a way that we'll meet local people, and he'll probably be able to kick a ball with some local kids. I'll be able to talk to them and talk to other people around and, meet people walking their dogs, that kind of thing. So this is my stealth plan to get to know more locals. So I will report back in later as to how that worked out. And a final message about thoughtful travel was from Nerea, and she said, for me, it's all about being present and trying to connect deeply with that particular place's atmosphere and soul, learning to slow down, enjoying the cultural differences, knowing at least a bit of its background, and essentially a mindful way of traveling. So that is absolutely my goal. For a good 8 days, we're based in one place, in one Airbnb in Copenhagen, and I really want to start to get to know, that little area. We're going to be using bicycles, so that should make it even easier. I remember a long time back, very early episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, we talked about slow travel. And one of my guests said that slow travel to him meant that the person at the coffee shop knew what your order was when you walked in the door. So, I think for me, I'm not a big coffee drinker, but for me, it'll be at the bakery, and they'll know exactly what I want to order when I walk in the door. So maybe that's something to strive for. Anyway, I hope that this has given you a bit of food for thought and a bit of insight into kind of how I see the idea of thoughtful travel playing out in a trip. And when I get back, I will tell you how it went and was I able to be thoughtful or not. So let's see. Please do come along to the Facebook group and give me your ideas about more, how you travel thoughtfully. And also, of course, any suggestions you have for what I should do while I'm in Denmark. I'll still be there when this comes out, I think. So do tell me more. And in the links in the show notes, I will leave a link to that post about thoughtful travel. And also I'll leave a link to this awesome book, The Year of Living Dangerously, Sorry, I keep getting that wrong. I know where it comes from. Also, that book is awesome, but it's actually The Year of Living Danishly is what I want to tell you about, by Helen Russell. It's an awesome book, so I really recommend it, even if you're not going to Denmark. It's just really interesting in terms of expat life in a different culture. So thank you very much for listening to episode 140 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. The show notes are at notaballerina.com/140. Do come along to Facebook and search for Thoughtful Travellers and join our group. And if you are curious to follow what I'm up to while I'm traveling, do head to my Not a Ballerina page on Facebook. If you go just to facebook.com/notaballerina, you'll find me, or look me up on Instagram. In Instagram, I'm at Amanda Kendall, and there will be all things Danish all over those places while I'm there during May. So thank you very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.